Cast members
What do we
is
have, about 120,000 followers now?
Yeah, right.
million.
My son watches a lot of YouTube stuff, and we do too. Like he'll find stuff and we can spiral out Star Wars videos all day long. But those people who have careers, all they do is make YouTube videos. I just don't know how did that happen? Some guy sat on his couch talking about Star Wars, and now he's selling products and making more than Jesus. You think everybody's coming? Who's coming, Bill? You were all waiting down there. I'm gonna wait for 10:05 to start.
Jimmy, I know exactly this much less than you do,
There you go.
at least.
Where's the link? I'll send it to that.
That's what I'm trying to.
Stacy, how's your dad doing?
Well, pretty miserable right now. But he's only got 2 weeks left. It will be divided up because of Thanksgiving. So it's really, and it is working. The treatment is working.
Oh, that's
That's
awesome.
fantastic.
So that's wonderful news. But yes, he was telling him they had pain and they offered him a pain patch Friday and he said, no, he didn't think he needed it. I said, always get
Take the pain
it.
patch.
You can change it. You don't have to use it.
Doesn't cost more.
Trying to get him to stay ahead of pain it's just ridiculous. Anyway,
Yeah.
he is improving.
Pull my stuff in, we'll have copy on the side. That is so good, Stacy.
It is.
Are we gonna need to start bringing our own coffee and donuts?
Uh,
Probably.
Well, I'm doing decaf, that's the only reason why I have my own. I figured out how to flavor it. It's basically not coffee, it's hazelnut creamer with a coffee.
It's a touch.
finish. Yeah.
I was gonna say, there's no other reason to drink it if it's decaf.
Right.
Mhm.
I like the flavor of coffee, but decaf does not quite get there. Starbucks is the closest that I've found. My new doctor. All right, let's get started off with prayer. Father God, we thank you that you are God who is present with everything in our lives. And you are God. Scripture says that you hide yourself in clouds, so there is a hide and seek to this thing, but God, you reveal yourself. And we want to be known, and we want to be found. And so you speak, you give us hints and clues and clear messages. And you do that through your Spirit. You do that through your Spirit speaking to us directly, through the voice of the community. You absolutely do it through your Scripture. Help us be drawn into that, into the life that you have for us, the adventure that you have for us. Thank you for sending your Son for us. In Jesus' name. Amen. We thank you for good word and station for that. Amen. All right. More nerdy things today. Still talking about biblical literature and things. Oh, Scott's been John, come join us, John Gibson. This is like when the principal sits in, right, and watches. Make sure things are lined up. John stepping in.
Calvin's son.
Just a reminder, if anybody needs it, the Google
He's been with
Classroom,
us before.
and I can put the slide up later with the code. I'll do that in the class. We've been looking at biblical genre types. Last week, we looked briefly at, that's always going to be briefly, at narrative and stories. This week, we're going to look at poetry. And next week, we're going to look at the discourse parts of Scripture, which will be things like law and letters. And we'll also next week look at some of the apocalyptic things. Just talk about some of the things about those. So those are broad genres. Those are the big three. And within each of them, there are kind of these generic forms. History, genealogy, biography, songs, poems, law, wisdom, letters, and apocalypse. We break those down even into more subcategories. Why is it important to study these? Well, as I mentioned last week, I think that when we read the Bible, we often overgeneralize it. So we read everything as if it's the same, but we don't do that when we read literature on our own. We kind of broken the Bible off where we don't get to experience it as literature. It is revealed, but it is literature, and it follows the rules of literature. And when you're reading a letter, you read a letter differently than you do a history book. And you experience a history book differently than you do a poem or a song. And so we are automatically aware of generic types in our own society. Nobody has to tell us. There are literature experts who can go into deep detail, but if I put a bunch of different songs in front of you from popular culture, you'd be able to tell me which ones are honky-tonk songs, if those things exist. Which ones are country songs, which ones are pop songs, teeny popper songs, because you know, and you might not even be able to say how you know, right? It might not be like, well, I know it is because of this, but you just kind of feel it. You can certainly know the difference between a textbook and a love letter. So there are forms that give clues, and there are forms that give clues in the scripture. If we're going to study scripture, then it's important for us to pay attention to those. So, as I showed you last week, most of the Bible is narrative, about 43, around everything, about 43% or so is narrative, and about 33% is poetry, and the rest is that discourse material, law, and literature. So it's a pretty even breakdown there, but the Bible's about story. God reveals himself through story. But the thing we're going to look at today, poetry, the most direct statements that God makes in Scripture. Outside of the Torah, outside of the law, when it's thus saith the Lord, when the prophets are saying that, almost all of that is poetry. So God's a poet. He's a storyteller and a poet. And so it might be important for us to kind of understand how that works. And I will make all these slides available on our classroom site. So last week we talked about exegesis. Exegesis is reading from the text. Eisegesis is reading into the text. And what we want to do, some people take a hard line on this, and they look at eisegesis as being negative, reading into the text as being negative. I think part of the interpretive process, part of bringing Scripture alive, is eisegesis. A good preacher reads the present context into the biblical story sometimes to make things clear. Good morning.
Good morning.
Look here. So you see the New Testament authors also read into the text things that they don't do good exegesis from a seminary perspective. So Paul says that rock that Moses struck in the wilderness was actually Jesus, right? And if you're reading that story of Moses striking the rock, if you just read that story, for me, if I was doing good exegesis, I wouldn't have come up with the Jesus thing. Paul's doing eisegesis, I believe, divinely inspired eisegesis when he does it. So there's a place for that. But Paul also knew what the scripture was at its core. I think Paul knew how to do good exegesis. And we always want to start with understanding the text as it, for as much as we can, as it was written in the context that it has. So that's exegesis. We're going to use a fancy phrase for that, Lectio Divina, and these come from church history in Eugene Peterson's book, Ethos book. He does a good job of breaking all these down. So Lectio is actually just reading the text, reading it closely, paying attention to the nuances in it, entering into that story. And then meditatio is you're reflecting on it, or maybe you're digging deeper into it. It's like a dog gnawing on the bone, is actually kind of the word that you take from the Hebrew text of what it means to meditate. And so, so you read it, and then you kind of go over it and over it. That word to gnaw is like, you know, when it drops you on the bone, maybe it's more like a lion chewing on the bone, where it's like that noise. The idea is that you repeat those things, you're murmuring the scriptures, but you're staying in it. And then oratio, which is to pray it, to speak it out loud, and then contemplation, which is put it into practice. You contemplate it, but you contemplate it actively. What does this mean for my life today? How am I going to do it? I think, I agree with Peterson in this. We've made exegesis like this classroom thing, but I think this is actually exegesis. This is really getting into the text, letting it shape us as much as possible. The whole process, and he makes a case for that in his book. So, and so last week, there's a kind of review. We talked about stories, and then how stories Aristotle said stories have beginnings and middles and ends, and all great stories have these kind of plot lines. And it's not always, sometimes the change happens real early, sometimes it happens late, sometimes there's a conclusion, sometimes there's not, so they don't all follow this, but there's a tension that moves these stories along, and a good story has a point of decision, something that changes the tact on that. And so those are individual stories, but when you look at modern movies, when you look at novels, but certainly when you look at scripture, really, the Bible looks like this. Story, 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 story. Like little sub-stories in these bigger stories. So one book, like Exodus, is going to have several different stories. Children being thrown into the river, Moses being saved, Moses killing men, Moses fleeing from Pharaoh. Those are all stories in and of themselves, and they kind of make up the overarching narrative of those stories. And for us, the Bible's that way. A bunch of stories that combine to one overall narrative that is about Jesus. And I just want to remind you that Jesus says that all Scripture is about Him. And that the reason that we study Scripture is to know about Jesus and become more like Jesus. That's the goal. And that's my metagame. That's my approach to studying Scripture. So, poetry and songs. That's what we're going to talk about today in Scripture. Anybody in here like poetry? Yeah? You read poetry? Good.
I mean, where the sidewalk ends is pretty solid.
That's about right.
I'm one of those guys who's always, I've wanted to like poetry, but I haven't, right? Like, I had a seminary professor that was just fantastic. Great guy. And he was into the poems of Seamus Heaney. And he would come in, he would start his class. He's just one of those guys, everything was intentional. So he'd come in and he'd have his tea. He'd usually kind of do his tea in class, and he'd just reflection. And he'd say, I want to read this tea. And he'd read one of these poems. And the way he read it, first of all, it was clear. He loves this poem. Like, he loves this. And he would read it, and just everybody would just be sucked into it. Like, oh, gosh, this is fantastic. So I bought some of Haynes' material, and I'm going to start studying these poems. It's so great. It just didn't work for me, right? I had to hear him read it. I wanted to be in it like he was in it, but it wasn't required that way. I think, for whatever reason, I think in the West, poetry is hard for us. We like history, we like stories, we like lists and facts. We don't do so well with the mushy-bishy poetry, metaphor kind of thing. Just tell us what it says, that kind of thing. Well, I feel like Jesus was a poet. He was a storyteller, right? But poetry leaves you hanging with the metaphor sometimes. It doesn't clear it out. But God likes poetry. If we believe that the Scriptures inspired, then God really loves poetry. He wants to convey things. And so, biblical poetry. We're going to watch one of these Bible Project videos that we did last week, because I love the material. It's a good kind of intro for us to get going. So, the art of biblical poetry.
So we've been learning how to read biblical narrative and showing how the Bible is one unified story. But 30% of the Bible is made up of ancient poetry. And I don't know about you, but I don't read a lot of stories where 1 out of 3 pages is some kind of poem.
Yet poetry is everywhere in the Bible. Some biblical books are entirely poetry. Most of the Hebrew prophets wrote masterful poems, and the majority of God's speech in the Bible is represented as poetry. It's also very common in biblical narrative for the story to pause while a character breaks out in poetic song. Like in the Exodus story, there's a narrative about Moses leading the Israelites through the waters of the sea, and that's followed by a beautiful poem about the very same thing.
Why a story and a poem? Wouldn't one version suffice?
Well, poetry has a different purpose than stories. Instead of describing the difference, let's just experience it.
Okay.
So, one part of the story goes like this.
The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through on dry land with a wall of water on their right and on their left.
That seems pretty clear.
Right?
Now the poem, telling the same event.
O Lord, by the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. Surging waters stood like a wall. Deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea. Whoa, a wall of surging water like jello and divine nostrils? This is intense.
Yeah, the poem ignites your imagination through the experience of verbal art. And biblical poets did this with a specific set of tools, and that's what we're going to look at the art of biblical poetry. The basic unit of any poem is the line, and then many lines are designed together to make a poem.
Okay, I'm used to this kind of poem. There's a meter, cadence, bum, 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 and there's rhyme. But poems in the Bible don't work like this.
Yeah, biblical poems are what you could call free verse. They don't use meter like some traditions of poetry do, and they don't use rhyme in the same way either.
So biblical poems have no order to them.
No, they just have a different kind of order. Biblical poems are most basically structured by couplets, two short lines that are carefully worded and placed beside each other. The first line makes the basic statement, and then the second line develops it in some way. It can do this by completing the thought, or deepening it with different words or images, or by contrasting it in some way. So check out the opening of Psalm 51. You can see it in action. In the first couplet, the poet asks God to show grace and love, but how exactly? In the second line, he requests forgiveness for his failures.
Okay, so this couplet is finishing one complete thought.
Right. And then the next couplet opens with washing as a metaphor, and then the second line offers a more vivid image, that of a priest in the temple purifying things so they can be in God's presence.
Okay, so taking an image and deepening it.
Right. And then this third couplet opens with the poet's awareness of his sin deep inside. And that's followed by a description of the sin being outside. It's like it's in public, visible to themselves and other people.
So this couplet takes an idea and contrasts it.
Exactly.
So couplets by nature are a bit repetitive.
But the repetitive language forces you to slow down and linger over the feeling and meaning of it all, looking at each idea from more than one angle. And then groups of couplets can come together around one key idea. It's like a diamond with many facets, each line offering a different glimpse into the same core reality.
So this poem is exploring what it's like to be forgiven, offered a second chance.
And that's the kind of experience that can change a person. It's worth savoring and pondering. Now, biblical poets also use repetition on a larger scale. In many poems, you'll find a key line that's repeated multiple times. That's called a refrain. Or they'll open and close the poem with a similar couplet. That's called an inclusio.
Now, some biblical poets love design.
Oh yeah, these are works of verbal artistry. These poets use repetition to create all kinds of elaborate patterns that invite the reader to make connections between different parts of the whole poem that open up even deeper layers of meaning.
Cool. So I'm feeling at home with ancient Hebrew poetry.
But remember, poetry isn't something you master and then move on. Biblical poems are a bottomless well. They're packed with a surplus of meaning for those who are willing to slow down and ponder them.
And they're trying to pull my mind in new directions and discover new ideas.
Exactly. And there's even one more tool that biblical poets have to do that very thing, and that's what we'll look at in the next video.
Okay, we're gonna stop right there on that. We'll watch one of the videos and see if they talk about the songs. We'll do a great job. There we go. Parallelism. So again, this feels to me a little bit like that scene in Dead Poet Society, where we're going to deal with what makes good poetry. You know, you get the meter scale, you get the metaphor scale, or whatever. I don't want to kill poetry, but to understand biblical poetry, there are some things about it that are important. And the key to almost all Middle Eastern poetry, even today, is this thing called parallelism. Okay, and it works like this. The basic structures, you might have synonymous parallelism. So they were saying you have a line, we're going to call it A. Okay, then you have a line that follows it. We're going to call that B. And you can have a number of these. Generally, there's 1, 2, and then there might be a C. And usually what happens in parallelism is one of these three things. And they were talking about this too, in terms of there's a parallel between A and B, but they're never exactly the same. Most often, there's a few times it goes in a backwards direction, but most often B is a clarification or deepening of A. It's still saying kind of the same thing. if I said it's raining outside, it'd be A. The drops of water are falling on fields, right? That B line gives, we're not talking about rain in general, now we're talking about drops of water in a field. That kind of thing. And then if there's a C line, usually C is like some kind of summary thing of that. The rain is falling from the sky, the drops of water on the field, the grass is growing, right? It's a different kind of thought, but it completes the whole thing. It all goes together. And that's called synonymous parallelism, and it happens a lot. So Psalm 2, verse 1. Let's look at that. Practice it. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? That's a synonymous thing. It's basically saying the same thing twice. That's why it's called parallelism. But it's not exactly the same thing. Nations and peoples are kind of the same thing, but in a Middle Eastern thought, peoples are going to be more about identity. Nations is a really broad term. That would be an example of a synonymous parallelism. If you're reading the Psalms, you're reading the prophets, you're going to run across this thing all the time. Okay? Why this is important in terms of exegesis is it could be possible if you weren't aware of parallelism to start going, well, this is one statement and this is another statement dealing with two different things. But they're really meant to be woven together to have one kind of feel and one kind of concept. So, and then Psalm 8:4. We'll go. In my mouth. Yeah, what is man that you are mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him? You can almost switch those, right? You still have the kind of the same feel. You know, this is generic. What is man? We get the Son of Man. It's a little bit. It feels then a dominant. It feels a single sun, right? It's a drop of rain versus the rain in general. That kind of idea. So there's that, making it a little bit more tangible in maybe the setting. The next kind of basic structure is the opposite of that. It's antithetical, where A does not equal B on purpose. Okay? So Psalm 10:1 and Psalm 106. We'll look at Psalm 10:1. Oops. Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Oh, that's not the right one. Those are the same. Let me try this one to make sure. 1:6, Psalm 1:6. Oh, here we go. The Lord knows the way of the righteous. The way of the wicked will perish. Right? Righteous is in one, perish. And that happens a lot as well, this antithetical thing. Two contrasts. Sometimes those contrasts are put together, and then it ends with a C that makes a statement about one or the other of those two. That seems kind of like, well, duh. They're either the same or they're different. So, what do you think? Well, it's important to realize that it's that A, B, maybe C structure. A, B, maybe C. The Lord is righteous. His justice will last forever, right? Those are kind of the same things. You're going to see that over and over in Scripture. And then this is this is the catch-all. And people debate these things. By the way, there's a debate about if anybody can understand what biblical poetry is. Because it doesn't really have that meter, it doesn't have that rhyme. What they do know is this parallelism exists, but sometimes it doesn't quite go the way we want. Synthetic is the way that we kind of throw everything else into the lump. But it's still parallel. And the thing that is consistent about the synthetic structures is that B is always going to be greater. It's going to be a multiplication of A, typically, or an extension of A. So it's a lot like the synonymous, but it might go off, it might not be as obvious that it's that kind of parallel. Psalm chapter 2, verse 6. As for me, I've set my king on Zion, my holy hill. That's an A-B structure. You think, those aren't the same. It doesn't say anything about the king and the second one. But from an Israelite frame of reference, they know that Zion is the place where the king rules from. So this isn't parallelism. It's not mentioning two kings or anything like that. I have set my king on Zion, and then my holy hill is that kind of emphatic kind of parallelism. It's not really obvious. This would be one of those synthetic structures. When it comes to numbers, there's interesting things in scripture when it comes to numbers, especially in poetry. Numbers in the Middle East are not like they are in the West. We use numbers for measurement. They use numbers for meaning. One of the archaeologists that was working in Iraq in the early 20th century, they'd been working digging these ruins, and he'd been working with the father's son, and he asked a question during a break one day, how old is your son to this man? And the dad says, I don't know, 15, 20? He's like, you don't know the age of your son? He says to the archaeologist, you know more than me how old he is. What do you mean? He goes, well, my son was born the year the Ottomans did this and this and this and this. So this archaeologist calculated it out. His son was up in his late 20s. He's like, your son's in, well, who knows? Who knows how old my son is, right? But they can do these genealogies where they give these ages. He lived to be 77 years old. And if you start pushing in, was he really 77? Who knows? If he was really 77. He had a full life, 77, right? We need to be aware that numbers in the scripture might not mean numbers the way that we think of numbers. I would always assume that numbers do not mean what we think of when we think of numbers. Go that direction first, and then go the other direction second, especially in poetry. So in poetry, Robert Alter points out here, he says, it may be easy to see how this dynamics of repetition, this parallelism, operates in a poem. He's talking about one from Genesis. By working back from the last line to the first. What does a poet do with numbers and semantic parallelism? If the system were really based on principle of synonymity, is he saying that there's always kind of an increase? There's always kind of a deepening or emphasis. One would expect to find pairings of the order of 12 and a dozen, that kind of parallelism. But in fact, that never happens. The invariable rule, as scholars have long recognized without making a connection with the underlying poetic principle, is that if you introduce a number in the first verse at the first A, you have to go up in the second, either by adding one to the number or by moving to a decimal multiple of the first number or a decimal multiple plus the number itself. One of the authors gone through and translated the entire translation of the Old Testament. He's very familiar with how these things work. He says that here's an example from Deuteronomy 32:30. How can one pursue 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight? Right? For us in the West, we want to go, see, 1,000 and 10,000. I've actually heard sermons talking about how one person went and prayed and sent 10,000 demons away. The verse is about the way it feels. Man, you can kick the tail of this many, you can kick the tail of them all. Right? That's the kind of thing that they're trying to get to. So, more often than not, B will be an increase in some way. A clarity, a deepening of A. And that's especially true when it comes to numbers. Sometimes there are sequential parallel types. And what that basically means is here we'll look at CPA6, Psalm 66. God settles the solitary in a home. Those who are by themselves, he settles in a house. He leads out the prisoners to prosperity. And notice here, over here on this side, we have NIV. Notice that it has singing versus prosperity. You notice the translation difference there? This is an interesting thing. This part right here, prosperity and singing. It's a translation of this Hebrew word. The thing is that word is often associated with joyful singing, but it has to do with success and prosperity. So which one do you choose? Well, the NIV went with singing, because the prisoners are coming out and now they're singing. And the ESV went with prosperity. So that's why there's a difference in those two. But the rebellious dwell in a parched land. So in this case, again, this is that A, B, C structure, right? Those that are alone, the prisoners, and now there's a contrast in C. The antithetical thing happens in C. And that happens a lot. A and B agree, C disagrees. Doesn't this feel like the community biblical society? Yeah. Sometimes there's a thing called, some people call it chiasm, it's from the Greek letter P, it's chiasm, and so, which looks like an X. This happens a lot in Hebrew poetry and in narrative as well, where you have the structure where A says something, and then there's B, and then there's C, and they call this C prime, and B prime, and A prime, and these two agree, and these two agree, and these two agree. And sometimes the emphasis is on this, and sometimes the emphasis is on where the X actually crosses. Okay? Isaiah 6:10. You're like, how am I ever going to pay attention to all these things when I'm reading the Bible? Do I really have to pay attention to all these things?
So if you're writing a paper for the Queen.
Only for writing the paper for the class. Make the hearts, you've heard this before, Jesus quotes this, right? Make the hearts of this people dull. This is one of those things, right? What it really says is make the hearts fat. Make their hearts fat. And their ears heavy and blind their eyes. Heart, ears, eyes. And this word for blind is to make them stick together, right? They can't even open their eyes. Lest they see with their eyes, right? And hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts. And turn, and then there's, so in this one it's actually A, B, C, A, B, A, and then there's a D line here that says, lest they turn and be forgiven. Right? Now, and maybe Daryl's right about writing a paper for the class, but when they wrote this, they knew what they were doing. Right? They knew what they were trying to emphasize and what they were trying to get people to picture. And remember, this is poetry. This is very classroomish. But this feels, when you enter into this as poetry, it feels.
It's also an amazing memory device because this is oral.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of my trips to the Middle East, my friend Neil, who plays a Middle Eastern instrument called oud. It's like a lute. The word lute actually comes from al-oud, the lute. Al-oud, that's where it comes from. So he was just playing. We went to this place where there's some young adult Arab people, and there was an arts kind of a place, and there was a guy there who was a great singer. He was probably 21 years old. We didn't know it. Neil starts playing, and this guy starts making up Arabic poetry and singing to it.
Was he literally 21 years old?
No, he could have been 30. Who knows? He looked younger. So that's my point. That's good. That's good. I didn't know what he was saying, singing in Arabic, and I recorded it. I should have played it here. Like, everybody in the room, you can tell, like he's pulling them in emotionally. He's just making it up on the fly. And I am certain, because I've read enough of Arabic poetry in translation to know that he was doing this. They do this kind of naturally because it's part of their culture. It's the way they communicate in terms of poetry. And it is, I think, a good memorization device. You know, I mentioned one of my weeks that we were teaching about nationalism and the genealogical meditation, that book about the Bedouin, and they're telling all their genealogies. What's interesting is they'll be telling their genealogies, he's recording on this tape, you know, these things, and then they'll break into these songs. And I think the songs are these keys to helping them memorize these great, big, long genealogies. But the structure of it mattered, the emphasis of it mattered. If we believe that Scripture is divinely inspired, then we have to believe that this matters, how it was put together. Jesus quotes this passage. So, I will tell you one of my frustrations, and I hesitate to share this sometimes, but I just want you to know that this text right here, one of the things that I love about Hebrew, this, is it feels just gritty. It's not, Hebrew poetry is not up here, it's make their hearts covered in fat. And this is a culture that knows how to sacrifice things, knows how to butcher things. They know that a heart covered in fat is not right? Make it fat, make their ears heavy, and make their eyes stuck together. Feels a little different. So. And there's also inclusio. This happens a lot. These are hard to catch sometimes because they can't be separated. The Sermon on the Mount has an inclusio. Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed those who are persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, right? You say two phrases that agree with each other, and that encapsulates, that tells you this is the beginning of this section, this is the end of this section, everything in there fits under these definitions, right? So Psalm 1 and 2, Psalm 1 says, begins with, fortunate is the man who walks not in the way of sinners. And the end of Psalm 2 is just the same thing, blessed is the man. And most scholars feel like that's Psalm 1 and 2 is kind of set off as the introduction to the whole book of Psalms. Those two Psalms are meant to go together. So anytime you see repeated phrases like that, look at what's in between them. It might be that's trying to do an inclusio. It might not be actually introducing something new or anything like that. It might be encapsulating something together. And also remember that I don't think that they wrote much of this by accident. I think when the Bible was being written, I think most of it was written with a lot of intent. So if there is two phrases that are the same, that's a clue. It's a big thing to pay attention to.
So Jimmy, kind of a side note,
Yeah.
would the Psalms have been written or just passed down orally?
I think initially they were passed down orally, but so there are 150 Psalms in 5 books. The Psalms are broken down into 5 sections. The first 2 sections are considered Psalms of David, either written by David or about David. The rest of the Psalms are hymns that are like worship hymns, pilgrimage hymns, laments, so then incorporates no more individual. It's generally, the thing that we have to remember, I guess, is that we know this about the Bible, that these texts were being written and compiled and gathered over a period of time. But they're not really put together until after 586, 587 BC. When the Jews are sent into Babylon, that's when all these things that were so important to them become, some scribes came and put them together. They didn't create them, but they did edit them, and they did weave them together. So the Psalms are a good example. It'd be like if we got exiled, we got kicked out of our country and taken into captivity. All those things we haven't been paying attention to very much, have suddenly become really important to our culture. What are our songs? Which songs do we sing that are about us as a people? And so, there are thousands of songs that were sung. We have a collection of 150 of them that have this overarching narrative about exile and return, and the hope for worshiping the temple again, and those were collected with intent and structure. When David was singing songs at En-Gedi about running from King Saul, I don't think there was a scribe there writing down what David was singing. He was probably sitting there playing some kind of musical instrument. And that just became a repeated thing. That's a song that becomes important to them, and at some point someone writes it down. We know that when Jeremiah was prophesying right during this period, he was prophesying, and he did have a scribe who was writing down the poetry that he wrote. Right? And those get compiled later as well by that scribe. So it's probably a mix of those things. My guess is the Psalms were not originally written. Writing things is hard in that period of time, especially if you're on the run from a king, you're trying to hide out things along here. So another form of poetry is the acrostic poetry, and this is absolutely with intent. It's a great skill where each line begins with a different Hebrew letter. There's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So if you look at Psalm 25 or 34, 111, 12, 119, 119 is different because it's every 8 lines begins with a Hebrew letter. So there's 8 lines that begin with the first Hebrew letter, Aleph, 8 lines that begin with Beit, and so that's why that psalm is so long. It's 8 times 22 verses long. The book of Lamentations is written in acrostic, except for the last chapter. So 5 chapters, 4 of them begin, each verse begins with a Hebrew letter. The last one, except for the middle one, actually has 3 verses per Hebrew letter. But the last one doesn't begin, with the Hebrew letter each line, but it still has 22 verses. So it still has the number. And it's kind of that feel, if you read Lamentations, what they're wanting is order. Lamentations is about the destruction of Jerusalem. Someone's watching it take place, and it's a terribly violent book. Women who are feeding their dead children to their other children for so they can live. So that's the kind of thing they're wanting. You can tell that the poet is wanting order, wanting this hope. And it comes to chapter 3, which is a chapter kind of hope, and then it kind of falls apart again. And by the end of it, you get this kind of feel of like, there's lament and distress, but it still has 23 verses. If you lose the bearing of the letters holding it in place, but there's still this element of something to do. It's beautiful poetry. And psalm types. When you read the Psalms, which are these collections of books and collections of poetry, a biblical scholar named Gunkel kind of put together different types of forms. Just like the different kinds of letters have different kinds of forms, different kinds of worship songs have different kinds of forms, so do our psalms. And he kind of broke the big 5 down this way. Hymns, which are corporate songs said in worship. Communal lament, Lord, we are suffering, where are you for us? Personal lament, Lord, I am dying, how can you not rescue me? Thanksgiving songs or hymns, which could be individual or communal. And then royal songs that have to do with the establishment of a Canaanite songs. But here's what's interesting. When Gunkel put this together, you can actually put together the order. 1/3 of the Psalms are personal lament songs. Or a quarter, I think, are personal lament songs. When you put communal lament songs, 1/3 of the Psalms are lament songs. Most of the songs in the Bible, in the book of Psalms, are songs about distress. People calling out to God, wondering where he's at. And they have a form to them. The address of Yahweh, oh Yahweh. The complaint, here's what's happening to me. The petition, please do this. And then a statement of trust. It is terrible for me, but I trust that you're there. And then sometimes they add a 5th thing, which is the doxology, which they're going through praise. There's only one lament song, Psalm 88, that does not have the statement of trust or the doxology written. And it's just pure lament the whole way. And those are formal elements that, we can spend weeks just talking about those things. What I want you to know is that when you're studying Scripture, in this exegetical thing, look for those forms. Look for these couplets. Look for what is being said. Don't let that cause you to miss the feel of the Psalms, though, because there's a feel. So, look at this. This is Psalm 1. Psalm 1 is one of those things that I had New King James Bible that was given to me when I graduated high school. And I remember exactly where I was at the night that I memorized Psalm 1. And I went over it and over it and over it for like an entire whole evening. I can remember. What's strange is that physical remembrance of doing it with that Bible. I can still remember this song. It's an incredible thing. How that works. But this is, we could break it down and do the A-B structure here. Right? So ABC, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. So this one has a D line, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. And in his law he meditates day and night. So you've got these first 3 that are kind of parallels. You've got this D1 and D2, which are parallel. But if you just focus on that, that's important. That's the reason I'm taught. I think it's important to know. But notice the movement of this song. Blessed is the man. The word blessed is actually fortunate. Man, it's great for this guy. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. What's next? Stands. He's walking. And now he's standing. Nor sits in the seat of scoffers. What has happened to this guy? Yeah, the opposite of the blessed man is a man who he was walking along and then he ended up just kind of standing around. Now he's just stuck. That kind of visual image. You can enter into that when you're seeing these songs. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, And in his law, he meditates. This is that word about gnawing on the bone. He's just going over and over, murmuring it. So he's happy in it. He's just kind of in it. And then it kind of switches the metaphor. Right? He's not like this person. He's a person delighting. He's like that lion chewing on the bone. But now it's like he's like a tree planted by the streams of water. It yields its fruit in its season. Its leaf does not wither. All that he does prospers. The wicked are not so. So here's that change. They are like a chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, or sinners in the congregation of the righteous. The Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So at first it's this picture of this man that's like on this journey, he gets nowhere. And then this tree by the rivers of water that bears fruit and season, its leaves never wither. What does that tree sound like? It could be like an evergreen tree, maybe like a cypress tree, like a or something like that. Live oak, something like that. So remember that meta-narrative thing, that we have these little sub-stories and then there's overarching stories. And part of studying Scripture is seeing it all fit together. If you turn to the last 2 chapters of the book of Revelation, the heavenly city of Jerusalem comes down and makes its place here on earth, and God makes his dwelling among the mortals. And there's a temple, but there isn't really a temple because God is the temple. And there's no light because God is the light. And out of this temple comes a river. And on either side of the river, this is interesting, on either side of the river grows a deep tree of life, whose leaves don't wither. This picture of this tree of life starts at the beginning of the book of the Bible, and it's at the end of all the books of the Bible. And this picture that a person who is a righteous person is almost like a tree of life. Right? This eternal kind of concept. So there's other pictures in it. I think that for me, it used to be that when I would get to things that were poetry in the Bible, I would skim over them because I wasn't reading poetry. Just like in genealogies, I skimmed over genealogies until I read a book about Middle Eastern genealogies, and I realized how important they were, and I started paying attention to them. When you're studying the Scripture, like the 1-year Bible has a psalm reading every day. I think that's a really cool way to approach Scripture. I think Jesus was in the Psalms every day. They were the songs of the people of Israel. I'm going to sing the songs of Jesus. I'm going to know the songs. That's an important thing. Pay attention to these structures, but don't lose. Let it take you places. So when the psalm says something like, when Yahweh shows up on clouds, he throws down his mighty lightning bolts. Let yourself think what it's like. We're Oklahoma. What is it like to be caught in a thunderstorm? Where the thunder is, and his voice shakes the nations, and trees shatter, and the does run away. And then there's songs that kind of capture this idea of a storm coming in, and God is in it, and it shakes the earth, and then it moves on. And if I don't let myself get into that song, I'm going to miss the feel of it. Because there's a heart to it. So, any questions or thoughts? This is actually the hardest one for me to teach because it's not been a part of my core part of doing Scripture. And so probably the last 3 or 4 years getting into the Hebrew poetry. Daryl, do you think that? Anybody else?
What do we do with this?
What do you do with this? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm not answering that.
I didn't let her answer.
Well, I
Like
think,
that.
go ahead.
Anybody?
Well, I do, kind of what you said, like, let yourself experience it. Maybe that does kind of answer. It's been very recent since I'm getting a little bit more into poetry, and part of that came out of the New Room Conference. There's a young black guy who's just amazing. He is a poet, and he's doing what you're talking about.
Maybe the best thing to do is go listen to great poets and then try to think about how that works in the Bible. I think they were great poets. They're bringing to life something that you can't express with, sometimes you can't express things in there. It just can't be done. You were gonna say something?
I just think that reading the Psalms is more powerful when you read them out loud. I mean, it's something to sit and read Psalm 1 and, bless his name, walks away. But it's something different to say it out loud and then read it again with the emphasis in the areas that maybe God nudges. Because when I read Psalm 1 and I look at the first part of that where you talk about, when I use the word planted, to me, when he talks about the way of the wicked and the person who walks the path and finally sits, he has decided to join those rather than to join the righteous and walk in them. And so there's a recognition of the distinct differences between walking with the wicked and walking the way of the righteous. And so when you read that and you hear it and you think through that distinction, because the movement from, I'm gonna casually join with this group of friends, and then I'm going to really get involved with that group of friends. And there's a change in who you are from the beginning to sitting with them.
Yes. And I guess what are you supposed to do with that? I think what we're doing right now is what we're supposed to do.
I mean, I'm just a meat and potatoes guy. I'm that guy that I want to know.
Well,
Tell me what it means.
I'm saying that I think you're supposed to wrestle with it. I don't know that.
Jimmy, that's not why we recruited you.
Sometimes you experience God straight up, and sometimes you wrestle with him at night, and you don't really know what it means, right? Like Jacob wrestles with God at the river, and Jacob wins, but he ends up with a broken hip, and I don't know what to do with that story. It's a feel. So there's a part of Scripture that's a feel thing, which I do think is difficult for us.
But doesn't this kind of go back to some of what you were talking about a couple of weeks ago on just storytelling in general, on if you give all the blatant details, the story isn't really that creative. You can't make it your own. You can't internalize it and apply it to your life.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you were going to watch any movie, it was going to be a great movie, and I sat down and told you exactly what was going to happen in that movie before it happened, and how you're supposed to apply that movie to your life. Right? My kids love these Marvel movies, and I love them too. I love Star Wars, and I've never really thought about what does that movie mean to me, right? I know that it has meaning for me. I believe that life, I'm like, I want to be like Luke Skywalker. I'm not like it. Or Anthony. I want to be a hero. And they'll just tell me how to apply that. At the end, it's like, look, this movie's about being a hero, and here's point A, B, and C of being a hero. It's more like these things, the drawings, and I think a lot of the Scripture is like that. Which may be frustrating if you want to have, if you're geared as a society or as an individual to be, well, it's supposed to be instruction, but just tell me what I'm supposed to do. It might be that part of God where God hides in shadow. He's like, I'm not going to tell you exactly how to apply that. Although with Psalm 1, I could say, if you don't want to be in that first guy list, the way to be in the second guy list is delight yourself in the word of the Lord and meditate on it day and night, right? That meditate. What does this mean? What does this mean? What is this? It's interesting. We're memorizing it. That there's something to that that establishes a person in a way that brings this lasting life and fruit. But it might be hard to point out what exactly that was.
Tim Tennant, the seedbed, has a kind of a devotional book on the Psalm, and he helps point out a lot of this. So if you want a tool to help you as you read through the Psalm, that's a resource that you could have alongside it. That might bring it to life in a more devotional, personal way.
And we're going to look at in this class, because we still have to talk about prophecy too, which is poetry too, but somehow I resonate with more than the Psalms. That life can only be described by metaphor, really. Life is too big for me to talk about the details of it. And I think the human language that God uses consistently in poetry is a metaphor. this is emotional. So I don't have to deal with all these pressures because, Lord, the water's up to my neck, the seas are raging. Well, what, I'm not even around the sea. No, I'm around the sea. All these pressures are piling up. So I use a metaphor. You guys need to get to worship so that Jay's not upset with all of us. Thanks for bearing with me. This is the hardest one for me because I'm still just learning.
It's good, Jimmy.
Very good.
Very good. Thank you.
Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word. Lord, we're all students and we're all learners. That's what the word disciple means. We're apprentices of you. And Lord, we know that this is your scripture that we hear in Jesus. This is the scripture that you studied with me. These are the songs that you sing. You really find yourself, God. Help us to enter into that part of your life. And be your students. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. I listened to the message this morning.
If you haven't joined the classroom